As you reach the end of a long, hard journey, there's something quite satisfying about unlocking weapons that have incredible damage-dealing potential. Because it's one thing to scrape through those final encounters by the skin of your teeth, but it's another to rock up knowing you're sporting some of the absolute best gear that game has to offer. Some of this gear may be defensive in nature, giving you a high degree of confidence that you can take a serious pummeling before falling to one knee. But it's the offensive side that often catches the eye, and this often relies on the appearance of legendary, super, or ultimate weapons. These powerful instruments of war are known to significantly amplify the damage output of their wielders, but how they have manifested over the years has seen a high degree of flux. You see, not all ultimate weapons are equal. Some can be wielded by almost anyone, while others can only be wielded by specific individuals. Some must be found hidden in dark, dank depths of perilous dungeons, while others must be forged by the finest artisans to exist in their respective worlds. Each, however, has one thing in common. They offer power. Power that is unrivaled. The how and why is most interesting though. And it's for that reason that we're excited to explore this particular topic in our typical granular style. This video will serve as just the first episode in a huge multi-part series that will explore, we hope, every single ultimate weapon, or at least classification of ultimate weapon, to have been associated with the Final Fantasy franchise in chronological order. So with that in mind, we encourage you to sit back and relax as we explore the complete evolution of ultimate weapons. The original Final Fantasy featured numerous categories of weapons. Some of these were exclusive to certain jobs, but not all of these categories were equal. Some, such as the nunchaku, featured very few weapons, while others, such as swords, featured many, many more. Most of these weapons were acquired through natural progression, with the most common route being purchasing from various weapon vendors that could be found throughout the world. But some weapons could also be obtained through two other methods, drops from enemies or being found deep within dungeons. And it was through the latter method that the strongest weapon in the game could be obtained. As the Warriors of Light learnt the truth about what was transpiring, they ventured into the past, 2,000 years into the past to be precise. They sought to put a stop to Garland's nefarious schemes, and when navigating their way through the Chaos Shrine, the game's final dungeon, it was possible to take a pretty significant detour on basement level 4 to obtain the Masamune, a very purposeful weapon as it paid tribute to Goro Nyudo Masamune, a legendary Japanese swordsmith who had lived during the Kamakura era. As such, the Masamune in the original Final Fantasy was classified as a katana, itself a subclassification of sword, and it offered unparalleled raw attack power when compared to every other weapon within the same grouping, but also any other grouping. The Masamune was also equipable by any character irrespective of their assigned job, and this was a unique trait as no other weapon in the game had the same unrestricted access. Even the wooden staff, which was considered one of the most accessible starter weapons, was not equipable by thieves. And this meant it was down to the player to determine which of their characters should wield this weapon of immense power, as there was only one Masamune available. The placement of where and when the weapon was obtainable was also purposeful, as it was in the final dungeon right at the point of no return, an equalizer, or indeed something much more for an already overpowered party as they ventured into the final showdown against Chaos. Alongside the Masamune was another weapon that had significant strength, a sword called Excalibur. And although it didn't have the same raw power as the Masamune, it could deal even more damage given the right circumstances because of its holy elemental alignment. There was a severe limitation though. Whereas the Masamune was equipable by all, Excalibur could only be wielded by a knight. Its acquisition was also far more complex, as instead of being bought, found or obtained as a drop from an enemy, it had to be crafted. And this was a curious note, as based on legends real or mythological, you'd have expected the Masamune to have been crafted, and the Excalibur to have been found due to its association with King Arthur and both the sword in the stone and the sword in the lake. Regardless, to craft Excalibur, players need to obtain a rare mineral called adamantite, which was found on the second floor of the Flying Fortress. They then needed to visit Mount Eureka, or the Dwarf's Cave, where inside they would find a blacksmith called Smith. Give Smith the adamantite, and he very kindly made the Excalibur sword. Unlike the Masamune, this meant the Excalibur could be used to finish up any other challenges the player wanted to do so before tackling the final dungeon, as opposed to being locked into a point of no return scenario. Final Fantasy II ended up sharing some similar traits with the original game, such as the art style, the turn-based battle system, and commands. But many of the underlying mechanics that fueled the gameplay were created from scratch, and this made for a very different kind of experience. At its core, this meant the job system was done away with, allowing every character to be whatever they wanted to be. Those who favoured swords, however, were able to make use of the game's best weapons, and at the top of the tree was the Masamune. However, even though the in-game description hailed it as a katana of unequalled power, the Masamune was now classified as a sword. But it wasn't just the raw power that made the Masamune so strong, as it also removed the pesky magic penalty which affected every other weapon in the game. Much of this was similar to the Masamune in the original Final Fantasy, and as if to emphasise the relationship, this new iteration had a near identical method of acquisition. It was found at the point of no return on the 5th floor of Pandemonium, the game's final dungeon. It was also found in a secret room, and it was a one-of-a-kind weapon. Alongside the Masamune, Excalibur returned as the second most powerful weapon. However, even though it did continue to feature enhanced damage against specific enemy types, due to its relative attack power being so low by comparison, this was not enough to boost up its damage to a comparative level. It did, however, still have a more unorthodox method of acquisition, as it could be obtained as a gift from Elena inside Castle Deist. But Excalibur was not unique, and an unlimited supply could also be obtained as drops from Iron Giants, the game's pseudo-super boss. Before we dive into exploring how Final Fantasy III evolved the concept of ultimate weapons even further, did you know that we currently have over 350,000 subscribers, but that over 65% of the people who watch our videos are not subscribed? If you're not subscribed and you choose to subscribe right now, you can get us way closer to our next big milestone, hitting 375,000 subscribers. Patreon supporters also get early access as a perk, so if you want to watch part 2 of this series before its public release, head to patreon.com/ffunion to find out more. But with that, let's get back to talking about some weapons. As the franchise moved on to Final Fantasy III, new concepts were introduced, others that had fallen by the wayside were brought back, and elements from the previous installment were retained, or in some cases developed. And that was what happened with the notion of ultimate weapons. In the 2 previous games, the Masamune had stood out as the premium offensive piece of kit. It was equipable by every character, offered an incredible damage boost, and was easily accessible. It just needed to be found in the game's final dungeon. Each game did, however, include a sub-ultimate weapon in the Excalibur, and across the 2 installments, Excalibur adopted very different traits. But it was those traits that influenced the ultimate weapon in Final Fantasy III, as opposed to the ones associated with the Masamune. The Onion Sword stood as the most powerful weapon in the game in terms of raw attack. It was again a sword, and its method of acquisition was nearly identical to the ones used to obtain Excalibur in Final Fantasy II. The only difference was that instead of being dropped from Iron Giants, the Onion Sword was dropped from various types of coloured dragon. It was also locked to being used by a specific job, except instead of being the Knight, as was the case with Excalibur in the original Final Fantasy, it was now the Onion Knight. Due to the job chain system returning, this did, however, still mean that any character could use the Onion Sword, but to make full use of its power, players were required to invest a lot of time, and this was quite contrary to previous ultimate weapons that were more pick up and play. The main challenge was that the Onion Knight was inherently a very weak job. Up until level 87, its stat growth was terrible, but after that point, stat growth accelerated, and by level 99, Onion Knights had maximum stats across the board. When then combined with the Onion Sword, this made for a very powerful combination. And with it possible to obtain an unlimited supply of Onion Swords, It meant the entire party could be outfitted as offensive powerhouses, and this had never been possible before. For those who did not want to invest the time, however, Final Fantasy III continued with a theme of including sub-ultimate weapons, except the concept was now expanded upon, as instead of there being just one sub-ultimate weapon, there were now 5. Each weapon could be obtained in Eureka, an optional dungeon that for many has served as the game's penultimate dungeon. This made their acquisition similar to the Masamune, with their status reflected by where they were acquired by comparison. As instead of simply just being found by exploring off the beaten path, players also had to defeat a tough boss to prove themselves worthy. Of the 5 obtainable weapons, 2 were familiar, as due to the inclusion of the Onion Sword, both the Masamune, which was reclassified as a Dark Blade, and the Excalibur were demoted in status. They were then joined by the Moonring Blade and the Elder Staff, which were the first 2 non-sword type weapons to be given any kind of inflated status, but they were also joined by another sword, and this was the most powerful of the Eureka weapons, and it was called Ragnarok. Whereas Final Fantasy I and III had nameless Warriors of Light serve as the main protagonists, Final Fantasy II had featured a specific cast of characters, and this approach was revisited for Final Fantasy IV. This time, though, each character had a specific role to play, and their development as the game progressed was well defined as opposed to them being malleable. This then saw a significant evolution to the traditional concept of ultimate weapons, as instead of being available for anyone to wield, they were now assigned to specific collections of characters or isolated characters who adopted specific jobs. To further this, not every character was granted access to an ultimate weapon. Ragnarok, which appeared in Final Fantasy III as the strongest sub-ultimate weapon, had its status elevated. It now stood as the strongest weapon to appear in Final Fantasy IV in terms of raw power, and it was exclusive to Cecil, a paladin. Its method of acquisition was also similar to Final Fantasy III, as a tough boss needed to be overcome, in this case Dark Bahamut, but as if to blend with Masamune from the first 2 games, this encounter took place in the game's final dungeon, the Lunar Subterrane. Ragnarok, in addition to its raw power, also had holy elemental alignment. This mirrored the additional utility afforded to Excalibur in the original Final Fantasy, where it was exclusive to knights. And Paladin, in this instance, can be seen as an extension of that job. As Cecil was considered the main protagonist of the game, it made sense for him to have access to the most powerful weapon. But because of how much narrative growth there was for individual party members, especially in comparison to the 3 previous games, the developers wanted to make sure that players were rewarded for their investment. And this meant many other ultimate weapons were created, but how they manifested differed depending on the character. Kain, for example, was the only character able to wield the Holy Lance. And just like the Ragnarok, a tough boss called Plague had to first be defeated in the Lunar Subterrane. Edge had 2 katana that were obtainable through the same method. They had differing levels of power, but the addition of 2 was necessary due to Edge's dual wield ability. One of them was the Masamune, and the other was the Murasame, a powerful katana in its own right that first appeared in the original Final Fantasy. It was perhaps a named reference to the prominent weapon from the novel Nansou Satomi Hakenden. Rydia also had a unique weapon, a whip called the Dragon Whisper. This was a rare drop from random enemies, but the other weapons obtainable in the Lunar Subterrane were shared across multiple characters. These included the Artemis Bow, the Stardust Rod, and the Sage's Staff. With Final Fantasy IV not selling that well in North America, alongside working on Final Fantasy V, Square opted to create a standalone game that was tailored to the North American market. But instead of using a previous mainline Final Fantasy game as the base, Square Osaka, who had been assigned to the task, built upon Saga 3 instead, as this was the game they had just finished working on, and the turnaround times they were given were quite tight. When compared to a typical Final Fantasy, this meant the experience was quite bare bones, and this related to almost every aspect, including weapons. Benjamin, the main character, could wield numerous types of weapon, but each category had only a handful of options. Regardless, the most powerful weapon in the game, in terms of raw power, was still a sword, and it was called Excalibur. Just like earlier ultimate weapons from the regular games, Excalibur just needed to be found, but it was not located in the game's final dungeon. That mantle was instead reserved for the game's ultimate shield, the Aegis Shield. Instead, Excalibur was located in Panuzu's Tower, the game's penultimate dungeon. While Mystic Quest was to be a simplified game, designed to make everything much more digestible for North Americans, Final Fantasy V was to be the most detailed game to date. This saw aspects of Final Fantasy III and IV combined to create a wholly original game, one where a cast of named characters were able to switch between over 20 different jobs, and even create unique combinations of commands through the mastery system. It was perhaps because of this that even though the concept of ultimate weapons was retained, there were some clear parallels to Final Fantasy III, but there were also some elements incorporated from every other game too. Ragnarok reappeared as the game's strongest weapon in terms of raw attack power, and just like in Final Fantasy IV, it could be obtained from the game's final dungeon after overcoming a tough encounter. This time, however, it was not just a regular run-of-the-mill boss, as to obtain the Ragnarok, players needed to overcome one of the franchise's first proper super bosses, Shinryu, and this made it a one-of-a-kind weapon. Should they be successful, then Ragnarok was locked to specific jobs. One of them, the Knight, was quite standard by this point. This job was explicitly associated with an ultimate weapon in Final Fantasy I, and tangentially associated in Final Fantasy III and IV through the Young Knight and the Paladin. But in Final Fantasy V, freelancers could also wield the Ragnarok, and this was again a nice reference back to Final Fantasy III, as the freelancer started out as the weakest job, but could become the most powerful, just like the Young Knight. Even though Ragnarok stood as the strongest weapon in Final Fantasy V in terms of raw power, another weapon had the potential to become even stronger, the Chicken Knife, a one-of-a-kind weapon that could be found in the town of Moor in the Merged World after following a secret network of passages, and then, after speaking to the old man, choosing to be a coward by selecting the box on the right. What made the Chicken Knife unique was its damage formula. When first obtained, its attack power was negligible, but its power increased every time the party escaped from a fight, and after 254 escapes, its attack power capped out at 127. In the original version of the game, this was higher than Ragnarok, which had 125 attack power. But what made the Chicken Knife truly excel was its unique damage-dealing formula, which took into account a character's agility, and this could boost its output even higher. The other positive was that the Chicken Knife harkened back to the ultimate weapons of old, as it was equipable by almost every single job. The only exceptions were Monk and White Mage. The other weapon of note was the Brave Blade. Similar to the Ragnarok, this could only be equipped by knights and freelancers, but it could only be obtained instead of the Chicken Knife. In the original version of the game, the Brave Blade came with a raw attack power of 150. However, its damage output only had the potential to decrease, something that happened every single time the party ran from an encounter. And this was based on every retreat, not just those that happened after acquiring the Brave Blade. But even at maximum power, because the Chicken Knife had its unique damage-dealing formula, it still had the potential to be more powerful than the Brave Blade. Alongside these three weapons, Final Fantasy V also had an array of sub-ultimate weapons called the Sealed Weapons. Unlike in Final Fantasy III, however, the Sealed Weapons were now incorporated into the narrative. There were 12 in total, and to acquire them, special tablets that had been hidden throughout the world needed to be found and then exchanged. The acquisition of one tablet was mandatory, and this marked the first instance of a classification of ultimate weapon not being optional. But the others could be skipped over unless the additional tablets were obtained. Amongst this group were numerous high-profile weapons that were classified as ultimate weapons in Final Fantasy IV. These included the Masamune, Excalibur, the Holy Lance, and the Sage's Staff. The rest of the weapons had also featured on the higher end of the power scale in previous games, such as Sasuke's Katana, which was only bested by the Masamune in the original Final Fantasy, and the Rune Axe, which was the strongest axe-type weapon in both Final Fantasy II and IV. Many of these weapons were the best in their categories, but that wasn't true for all of them. For there existed 3 weapons that were more powerful than the sealed weapons, but less powerful than the likes of Ragnarok or the Chicken Knife. The Masamune, for example, was superseded by the Murakumo. The Holy Lance was inferior to the Dragon Lance, and the Sage's Staff was weaker than the Judgment Staff. The other interesting aspect about these three weapons in particular is that they could only be obtained by stealing, and they were offered as rare steals from a selection of random enemies as the game reached its conclusion. Final Fantasy VI built upon the narrative principles of Final Fantasy IV by introducing even more named characters. Each was again given a specific job, and weapons were shared amongst some characters while being locked to others. This then had implications for the game's Ultima weapons, as they were locked to specific characters too. And just like in Final Fantasy V, other elements were also introduced that made the classification of the game's ultimate weapon a bit more difficult to interpret. And this was because in the original version of the game, 3 weapons had the maximum available attack power: Lightbringer, Ragnarok, and Ultima Weapon, and they were all only equipable by Terra, Locke, Celes, and Edgar, the 4 characters that many perceive to be the game's main protagonists. Amongst the trio, Lightbringer was considered the strongest, and it had an intimate relationship with the Ragnarok, because the Ragnarok had to be traded in order to even obtain it, and even the Ragnarok itself could be missed. During the World of Ruin, should Locke be in the party when they visited Narshe, the weapon shop owner offered to give the party a powerful magicite or melt it down to make a weapon. If they chose the latter option, then the Ragnarok sword was obtained. This had an attack power of 255, but it also granted some additional bonuses. Whoever wielded the weapon got +7 strength, stamina and magic, +3 speed, and +30% magic evasion. The Ragnarok also spent 20 MP per turn to enact a critical hit, and had a 25% chance of casting Flare in addition to its regular attack. Should the party then head to the Dragon's Neck Colosseum, the Ragnarok could be wagered, something that then opened up the door for the Lightbringer to land in the party's inventory. Although similar, it could be wielded by the same characters and had the same raw attack power, but the Lightbringer offered superior bonuses. This meant in addition to 7 strength, stamina and magic, it also offered 7 speed and 50% evasion and magic evasion. It also did spend 20 MP per turn to enact a critical hit, but there was now a 25% chance of it casting Holy as opposed to Flare. Ultima Weapon then served as an alternative to both Ragnarok and Lightbringer, as although it had the same raw attack power, it offered rather different bonuses. Instead of boosting stats, this saw Ultima Weapon instead ignore a target's defense when calculating damage, but there was one major drawback. Similar to the Brave Blade in Final Fantasy V, Ultima Weapon had a maximum damage output that could be reduced. This time, however, it was not based on running away from encounters, it was based on the wielder's HP. At maximum HP, Ultima Weapon did maximum damage, but the more HP the character lost, the lower the damage output. This made Ultima Weapon a very powerful weapon, but only under certain circumstances. The other unique aspect around Ultima Weapon was that its appearance changed based on its potential damage output. This meant the higher the wielder's HP, the longer the weapon's blade appeared. Unlike the other 2 Ultima Weapons though, Ultima Weapon was found in a dungeon, the Cave of the Sealed Gate, and this was neither the final dungeon nor even the penultimate dungeon. Another weapon featured in Final Fantasy VI built on the notion of things needing to be situational to maximise its potential, except this time it was related to a status effect. The Impartisan had an attack power of 253, slightly lower than the 3 aforementioned weapons, but that attack power was only activated if the character using the weapon had been afflicted by the Imp status. Otherwise, its attack power was set to the lowest possible, and this made it not too dissimilar to the Chicken Knife. The other aspect was that because the Impartisan was a spear, it received an attack bonus if the character used the jump command, increasing its damage further. For the other characters, outside of the 4 sword wielders and those who could make use of the Impartisan, Final Fantasy VI also offered a broad range of powerful category-specific or character-specific weapons. Many of these could easily be considered sub-ultimate weapons. The Radiant Lance, for example, was a very strong spear that could be wielded by Edgar and Mog. The Tiger Fangs were a strong weapon for Sabin, and Excalibur was there as another option for the 4 sword wielders, if they were unable to get their hands on the Lightbringer, the Ragnarok, or the Ultima Weapon. Beyond this, there were also some weapons with lesser attack power that used unique qualities to enhance their usefulness. The Valiant Knife, for example, which was exclusive to Locke, could deal considerable damage because it was similar to Ultimate Weapon but worked in reverse. This meant it ignored a target's defense stat and even the protect status, but it also applied bonus damage, and this increased as Locke's health decreased. It meant that Final Fantasy VI featured many powerful weapons, and this was due to a combination of the breadth of characters and available weapon categories. But it was also because the development team clearly just wanted to provide strong options for many of the prominent party members. And it was this last notion that then had the most influence on how Ultimate Weapons were treated moving forward. Final Fantasy VII placed a huge amount of emphasis on its playable cast, but they were no longer as unique from a gameplay perspective as in either Final Fantasy IV or VI. This was because there were no jobs associated with characters, and thanks to the materia system outside of limit breaks, each character was able to perform the same core commands and actions and cast the same spells. They just may not have had the same level of proficiency towards the start of the game. Perhaps to counter this more universal approach to character progression, each of them was locked into using only one type of weapon. This had been partially true for some characters in the past, such as Kain and Sabin, but even when characters had locked jobs, they were often able to wield multiple types of weapon. That was no longer the case in Final Fantasy VII, and it meant a concept that had been explored in the 4 previous games now became solidified. Final Fantasy III introduced a notion of sub-ultimate weapons. These were weaker than the Onion Sword, but they were still some of the strongest weapons in their specific classifications. Final Fantasy IV, V, and VI then adopted a similar notion. There was always a most powerful weapon, or at least a very small grouping, and they were always swords. But below this were category-specific ultimate weapons. And although some were locked to being wielded by only one character, many could be wielded by more than one. This was changed with Final Fantasy VII. Now, each classification of weapon could only be wielded by one character, and this meant each character had their own ultimate weapon. Amongst the selection, the strongest was Ultimate Weapon, at least in theory. This was a sword that was equipable by Cloud's Strife, and it could only be obtained by defeating a pseudo-superboss in Ultimate Weapon. It had the joint highest attack power, but the caveat was that its damage formula was carried forward from Final Fantasy VI. This meant Ultimate Weapon dealt maximum damage when Cloud was at full HP, but its damage output lowered as Cloud's HP was reduced. And just like in Final Fantasy VI, its appearance even changed as a way of visualizing its diminishing power. The notion of ultimate weapon damage based on unique formulas had of course been introduced in Final Fantasy V, and this was thanks to the Chicken Knife and the Brave Blade. Ultimate Weapon carried this forward to Final Fantasy VI and VII. But as each character now had their own ultimate weapon, they each had their own unique damage formulas, and some were worse than others. In this regard, even though Cloud had the potential to do the most damage, due to how the damage was calculated, it could be very inconsistent. Cid Highwind suffered from a similar fate, as his ultimate weapon, the Venus Gospel, had its damage output tied to MP, so anytime Cid used MP, his damage output would decrease. Tifa also suffered, as her ultimate weapon, Premium Heart, had its damage output based on how full her limit gauge was, and what limit level was selected. In the worst case scenario, if the limit bar was empty and she was set to the lowest level of limit break, this meant her damage was reduced to 1/16 of its maximum potential, and of course, it disincentivized using limit breaks. For this reason, many consider the game's most consistent ultimate weapon to be the Conformer. This was because its damage output was based on the level of the enemy being targeted, something that was quite beneficial, as it meant Yuffie, the character who could wield the weapon, rose to the challenge when fighting enemies that were higher level. Each of these ultimate weapons also had varied ways to obtain them, but most were either found through exploration or handed over as gifts at the conclusion of specific character narrative arcs. Final Fantasy Tactics was a very different kind of Final Fantasy game, as it fused the fabled franchise with the tactical role-playing subgenre. As such, it presented a unique approach to gameplay and storytelling, and it was perhaps because of this that ultimate weapons reverted back to form. This meant the game's strongest weapon, in terms of raw power, was a Knight's Sword, a specific subcategorization of weapon associated with various forms of knight that differed from regular swords. This category itself was a venerable treasure trove of the past, with Excalibur and Ragnarok appearing as available weapons, but neither were the strongest in the game. That mantle was now reserved for a new weapon called the Chaos Blade, which was said to be a gift from the gods themselves. Due to the sheer power of the Chaos Blade, its acquisition was made very tough. This meant, instead of appearing in the final dungeon, it appeared as a treasure on the final floor of an optional bonus dungeon called Midlight's Deep. This was not the only method of acquisition, however. Some previous ultimate weapons could be stolen from enemies, and this was the same for the Chaos Blade, except the method of stealing was changed. Enemy ninjas were capable of throwing weapons, but there was a reaction ability associated with the thief job called Sticky Fingers that enabled a target character to catch the thrown item. On level 9 of Midlight's Deep, if the party fought against a ninja, there was a chance that they might throw a Chaos Blade, and if you got lucky, this meant you could end up with multiple versions of the weapon. Even though the next mainline entry in the franchise was developed by the same core team as Final Fantasy VII, there were fundamental changes to gameplay. Through the junction system, players had a high degree of control over character development, and thanks to the draw system and guardian forces, any character could cast any spell and use any command. It meant the unique gameplay aspects for each characters were their limit breaks and their weapons. Each weapon type was locked to a specific character, but the volume of weapons now saw a dramatic reduction. This meant that while Final Fantasy VII had over 100 different weapons associated with the main cast of characters, Final Fantasy VIII only had 28. One of the main reasons behind this was the method of acquisition had changed. Weapons were no longer found, stolen, or obtained as spoils for victory. Instead, they reverted back to how Excalibur was acquired in the original Final Fantasy, as they now had to be crafted. As the main character, Squall Leonheart was able to wield the game's ultimate weapon. It was called Lionheart, and it had more raw power than any other weapon in the game. But there was also a secondary benefit. Whereas other characters had their limit breaks associated with other factors, such as magazines that could be read or even the stock of ammo in their inventory, Squall could only gain access to his ultimate limit break, Lionheart, if he wielded the Lionheart weapon. Therefore, it was more imperative for Squall than probably any other character to have his ultimate weapon to maximize damage output. Amongst the remaining characters, the majority only had 4 weapons. The only exception to this was Rinoa. She was given an extra weapon, and it meant that even though Shooting Star had less raw strength than Lionheart, it was still more powerful than the ultimate weapons for every other character. Final Fantasy IX reverted back to a similar format to Final Fantasy IV and VI, as it featured named characters that each had jobs, and this meant that even though some weapon types were locked to specific characters, others could be shared. Zidane, for example, had weapon exclusivity, but this related to 2 classifications and not 1, daggers and thief swords. Garnet and Aiko, however, could both equip rackets, but they also each had a weapon type that was exclusive to them, as Aiko could use flutes and Garnet could use rods. This then led to a significant deviation when it came to ultimate weapons, as though each character had their own ultimate weapons, something that was now seemingly expected as part of the game's design. The game's ultimate weapon was not wielded by Zidane, as he was the first named protagonist who did not wield a sword, at least not in the traditional sense. With the developers opting to use Final Fantasy IX to pay tribute to both the past and the distant past, this meant the game's ultimate weapon, in terms of raw power, was a knight's sword, and it was exclusive to Steiner. But instead of being Excalibur or Ragnarok, just like in Final Fantasy Tactics, a new weapon was introduced that was more powerful, and this weapon was called Excalibur II. It was a purposeful nod, and the developers made it one of the most difficult ultimate weapons to obtain in the history of the franchise. Again, similar to Tactics, this was because there was a notable challenge associated with its acquisition. Except, instead of having to trawl through a brutally hard bonus dungeon, players had to speedrun the entire game and reach a certain point in Memoria, the game's final dungeon, within just 12 hours. In the original Japanese and North American releases, this was a pretty big task, but in the PAL version, it was a monumental task as the game ran slower. The game's more conventional ultimate weapon was exclusive to Zidane, and it was called Ultimate Weapon. This meant that whereas Excalibur 2 paid tribute to the distant past, Ultimate Weapon was a more recent reference. As such, it featured a modified but similar visual aesthetic, but the damage dealing formula based on current HP in relation to maximum HP was removed. Its acquisition was still quite complicated, however. As the game reached its conclusion, players were required to ride a chocobo, head to a spot in the sea where the shimmering island once was, and then use a dead pepper at the correct spot to make the chocobo dive into the sea to retrieve the treasure. It meant that by the time Final Fantasy looked onwards to the PlayStation 2, the concept of ultimate weapons had grown in quite a considerable way. In the earlier games, the ultimate weapon was there to reward players who wanted to explore a little, there as a final boost for those looking to tackle the game's final boss. But as gameplay systems expanded, so too did the notion of ultimate weapons. This meant, as more types of weapons were introduced, so too did the volume of powerful weapons. And once specific named characters started to become the norm, during the PlayStation era, it became expected that each would gain access to their own ultimate weapon. However, throughout all this time, each game's ultimate weapon, as determined by raw attack power, has always been a sword, and in many instances, it's been specifically a knight sword. And this has been true whether the game is a mainline entry or a spin-off game. Once named characters became more commonplace, that weapon had almost always been associated with the game's perceived main protagonist, with Final Fantasy IX serving as the only major exception. But in order to see how the concept of ultimate weapons continued to evolve as the franchise grew, starting with Final Fantasy X, you'll have to make sure you check out part 2 of this evolutionary series. So, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, so that you're informed when the next part is published, immediately, which should be roughly in a few weeks. But if you're watching in the future, you'll also be able to find a playlist with all the parts contained within. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, Chris M. Walker, Christopher Gardner, Clever Chavez, EXP Required on YouTube, Gregory and Stephen, who are super special Onion Eye supporters. And of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.